Hello, I'm Brad.
And I'm Jason.
You are listening to Dice and Mind, a monthly podcast in which we explore the meaning of life through the lens of RPGs.
We're lifelong friends, a couple of guys in their 40s who along the way had families and became professionals. Over the years, we've talked about pretty much everything. But recently, we realized we both had an interest and some history with tabletop role-playing games. So,
In each episode, we will consider everyday stuff like science, religion, philosophy, and economics, all through the lens of a specific role-playing game and its dice mechanic. For example, what would I have to roll in the Edge of the Empire narrative dice system to get that promotion at work?
or would getting that paper published give me advantage on a subsequent D20 roll in Dungeons & Dragons?
If I were DM, likely not. But join us now and every month to think deeply, geek out, and explore how RPGs make the world just a little bit better.
This is
Dice in Mind.
We had a fantastic discussion last week and really only touched the surface when it comes to discussing leadership in the realm of RPGs. We started really leadership in general, and then we started focusing in on it. And I told Jason, and he agreed, we're going to come back to that, just as we will probably have to come back to this subject. And today we're going to talk about spirituality and faith and even religion. And this is a different discussion. I was just telling Jason, our friendship bonded 30 years ago over sitting and having discussions about faith because we come from different angles. So that's where our friendship started. Tonight, we're going to have a discussion about faith and spirituality and religion in a context that we haven't done before at length. And those of you who are listeners are going to hear this discussion for the first time. So it's going to be as interesting, hopefully, for you as it will be for us. So I was talking to Jason at the outset before we were planning, and Jace, you had mentioned some ground rules and things that we wanted to make sure we cover. Why don't I'm going to yield here because I think you brought up some good points, because I think we want to keep the focus on the right thing, folks. And that is the context. This is all in context of game playing.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So Brad and listeners, let's be clear, this isn't a ground rule because let's face it, Brad, you and I don't have those in our discussions, and no discussion that truly has merit and is in the sense of open inquiry can possibly have ground rules beyond just ensuring a certain modicum of decency, which we don't have personally, but we always have when we're recording. So not a ground rule, but Brad and I do want to start, or I'll own it. I want to start us to make sure we kind of do stay centered around coming back to role playing and just the rich depth of relevance in a lot of these games. Here is my premise, and I'm going to work as we chat, as we record, to make sure that Brad and I both don't drift too far from this. Here's my premise. My premise for this discussion, I'm a little biased. My premise for this discussion is that real life, not playing yet, real life, that we live in a galaxy, in a cosmos at large, that is probably teeming with life. Probably the vast bulk of that life is microbial or whatever equivalent you have over by Vega or Tau Ceti or wherever. But some of that life is without question sentient. And if we just run the math, because of the sheer number of star systems in our galaxy and the number of galaxies in our cosmos, in our universe, and the 14 some billion years, give or take some change, age of the universe, I'm going to assert here the assumption, and I'm also going to pull us back to it so that we don't drift too deep in any one direction. I'm going to assert this assumption, this base that wherever we go in real life, we have to contend with the reality, the eventually empirical reality, that we live in a galaxy, in a cosmos teeming with life, and to a lesser extent, but a major extent, teeming with sentient, self-aware beings, just like us, but better looking. So putting that out there. Oh, and I should say, before I turn it back over to you, Brad, I say this obviously biased with a certain sense of optimism, because kind of like Ellie Arroway's dad says to her in Contact, my favorite movie, well, Sparks, if we're the only ones here, then wouldn't it be an awful waste of space? I got that pretty close. So that's personal bias and optimism. At the same time, I think the general scientific consensus, given what we have learned in the past several decades about life, about the universe, life, the universe, and everything, I think that the general scientific consensus is increasingly in this direction, that the more we learn, the less tenable it is to assume that life is rare, but it's probably not. So that's kind of not our ground rule by any means. That's a starting assumption. Wherever we go, real or imagined, we're going to have to come back to that notion of, all right, but let's make this harder. We're not the only ones. Okay, so that's my bit. Brad, back to you.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because I come from I come from a faith that at times can be, for lack of a term, myopic in terms of its belief and understanding of what may be beyond us. I am of the mind that there is mystery and that science can coexist with faith. That's a whole nother discussion. We're not going to drift there, like Jason said, but that is going to be my premise is I can have faith, but I also can believe in science. Again, that's a political thing that's become a real hot button in the past 18 to 24 months, but that's what I'm going to go on. And because I go on that assumption and premise, when I game, I play that out. Now, there are people that I know who sit in a realm of Christianity where I come from that would probably be considered more conservative, that would not appreciate what I've done in terms of building faith and religion in the context of the D&D game that Jason and I play. I built a very rich, and I don't want to give too much away because Jason's character is just starting to find out about this, a very rich, deep, and complicated spiritual and faith system.
Just to interject,
yeah.
Brad created a deep, rich spiritual faith system in which a god essentially kicks my PC in the shnikes. But no, keep going, keep it highbrow.
Again, it rich, deep, and now that Jason mentioned, a little bit hilarious. When you look at the gaming systems that we've talked about, and Jace, you and I talked about this before, you can go back to the different realms within D&D. You can go back and, I was always fascinated because I started reading the books. I think I've mentioned a million times, I didn't play a lot of games. I read the Dragonlance series, the Chronicles series, and so on. And that had a very deep faith system that a lot of the story revolved around the premise of that faith. It's polytheistic. A lot of the faith that comes in D&D books is rich in faith, depending upon the realm you're in. And there were, even with D&D 3, when they were just pumping material out like no tomorrow, there were books specifically on the different faiths and realms. I've seen them. Then you move over towards Star Wars, and this is what, something we were talking about. Star Wars has it's not a religion, it's a spirituality to it, a faith to it. I mentioned Lor Santeca from episode 7, the beginning, where Max von Sydow, the actor, played it. And in the book, it talks about this faith or religion of the Force. Han Solo in episode 4 says, hokey old religion, So Star Wars is kind of a middle ground. And then you move towards Star Trek, where it is more of a Jason, I'm quoting you on some of this stuff, so I apologize. I'm plagiarizing. Kind of a humanistic quality. They didn't really address faith and spirituality until DS9, and they did it in a way that was very different. But again, I can go to D&D and I can go back to find source material going back to third edition or newer if I wanted to build or utilize an existing faith structure. I'm not necessarily going to find a lot of that in Star Wars outside of the Force. They don't really get into anything outside the Force. They don't talk about creator beings or anything. Star Trek, they have talked about creator beings, but from a scientific perspective. And I don't know if you remember, Jace, you might remember this more. It was when the Romulans and the Federation and all that came together to find the original DNA. Okay, you're shaking your head. Yes, so you remember. So it comes from a purely scientific perspective until Ira Bear and the folks threw in that curveball that is the prophets. So how do you play? I don't want this to be a discussion about how people that are relatively conservative have to play a monotheistic game because otherwise you're a Satanist. That's the 1980s all over again. And we've hopefully grown past that. But how can you play, independent of what our thought processes are personally for faith, how do you play faith in a gaming system? And let's be honest, D&D is the most diverse in this realm. You can play it with it. You can play it without it. It's very creative that way because there's a lot of material. Pathfinder, very similar. Starfinder, similar. Star Wars and Star Trek, though, I don't know. You can correct me here. That's a little bit more difficult to do because the only faith we've really seen of any note in Star Trek is the prophets.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think, like you said, some of the purely fantasy games clearly are imbued with religion and faith because there's such good storytelling tropes, no matter what you're doing or where you're coming from. And I want to come back to that in a minute. Star Trek, well, excuse me. I mean, you and I have had how many discussions as of late about DS9, which we both love, you especially. I find the whole question of the prophets to be fascinating, and of course they just did a beautiful job writing that. But right, Star Trek historically has stayed away from religion, faith, belief, initially because Roddenberry was dead set against it, avowedly antagonistic to religion, certainly to religion being in Trek. Star Wars, again, you and I and some of the guys, especially Brian, we've had these conversations over the years, and many people have, of, well, how much faith religion is there? I agree with you, Brad. I also think that they have stayed away intentionally from this topic, like in terms of not outright addressing it. We think of Star Wars, and we talked about this in one of our early episodes, but we think of Star Wars and we know, because he told us, Lucas created this story being a real devoted reader and thinker around Campbell's monomyth of the hero tale, and was kind of in really imbibed religious awareness, but really want to focus on the story, making it teleologically agnostic. How's that for nonsense? And they're very careful with that. So you're right, we don't have canon on all of that or any of that, and yet we have this galaxy full of, literally, we're told, countless civilizations. And let's face it, one of the highlights of every movie or episode or wherever we're going is invariably we get to see a new place, a new species. That's just fascinating. Well, presumably many of these peoples have religions, have spiritualities. It's always implied, but they never really go there. And I get that. I respect that. I'll turn it over to you with this.
Well, let me interrupt because
Yeah.
you only bring one. I owe myself, because I bet against myself that you were going to bring up that quote from Contact, because if you weren't going to at first, I was going to. Two, at the beginning of oh goodness, this is such a
I also have
terrible
a
thing.
favorite quote from Apollo 13, my second favorite movie, but it's not appropriate for the podcast.
Okay,
Sorry,
we'll leave that one
continue.
alone. Yeah. The second Kelvin Star Trek movie, the one with Khan. What was it? It was Star
Into
Trek Into the
Darkness.
Darkness. The
Phenomenal
beginning of
soundtrack.
that, the beginning of that is Kirk running because he had grabbed a scroll or something that was a somewhat of a religious artifact.
I forgot about that.
For that species, that civilization that lived there, and they went against the Prime Directive. And so at the end of that little skit, you can see them worshiping a drawing on the ground of the Enterprise. So they've dabbled it in here and there, but to your point, it isn't the point of the show. And I think the problem is that, especially at the time that Roddenberry started it, you couldn't have that discussion. It was a very different, I would argue you probably can't have the discussion now, but for different reasons. There was really more old time reasons why you couldn't intermix those. But I think also there's a point to it, whether he had a belief, whatever his belief system was or wasn't, he wanted to appeal to our humanity. And he wanted that to cross faith lines. So,
yeah, much
and
unity,
I'm gonna jump it back, but just for everybody's clarity and interest, our group of friends, and even some we haven't seen for a while, who we still connect with and talk with on Facebook, we are probably one of the I shouldn't say probably, we are the most diverse group of friends when it comes to faith and spirituality that I've seen. We all come from different angles in one form or another. We have a Christian, we have a Judeo-Christian, segment of it, Jewish and Christian. We have atheists and agnostics. We have friends who are Sunni and Shiite Muslim. So, but we all get along. But the discussion, when we got to faith, the interesting thing is we could have a conversation about it without it becoming acrimonious. And when it comes to gaming, I think it's important that you have that context and you're comfortable with that with people. I think nowadays more than ever. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I absolutely. And like you've said so many times in previous episodes, it's about people being welcome and having fun at the table. And how can we, or why should we, ignore or actively avoid matters of faith, spirituality, belief? Let's be realistic, listeners. We know from research that the vast, overwhelming majority of humans on this planet, or I suppose any others, but the majority of humans undoubtedly believe in something, whatever that is. I'm just thinking of the numbers in my head. If we wrap up Christianity and Islam in a fairly wide, loose bow, that right there accounts for the vast majority of people on Earth. But the point is that the vast majority of people have a belief system, whether it's Western or Eastern, whether it's indigenous, whether it is more text-based, whether it is more atavistic. Most when I say most people believe in something. It is seemingly inherent to the human condition. We don't understand why, but we know that is probably true because most people believe or accept something, and evidence clearly shows us, or at least intimates, that even deep into prehistory, I mean, we're talking, decades of millennia into prehistory, it seems pretty clear based on what we discover, what we find in the ground, that our earliest ancestors, in one form or many or another, had some kind of belief system. Why 40,000 years ago would you bury someone with ochre and beads? Right? We know that this is part of the human condition. And let's face it, a really good role-playing game as theater of the mind ought to allow us to take as much of human experience as possible and apply it into whatever the setting of the game is, so that we can experience something different and new and fun without leaving part of our humanity, without leaving part of us at the door. And so I think you and I, Brad, would agree, and I know we agree, that this can be a really fun, funky, sometimes difficult to manage element. Certainly difficult, I would think, for the GM. I've never tried to incorporate religion into role playing, but again, because I've only GM Star Wars, and exactly as you said, the Force is kind of the grand poobah of a belief system, even though clearly there are myriad others.
Yeah, and you bring up the idea of a GM, and I know it'll be interesting for those of you listening when this comes out or down the road. No matter when you listen to it, related to the timestamp of when this is released, I'd be curious to see if you've encountered, any of you listeners have encountered resistance to this. So, being Christian, I've developed a faith system in the game that Jason and I and others play that is not Christian. I think that's okay. I don't believe that I am doing something wrong. I won't get into the detail. I don't need to. That's a rabbit hole. But you're laughing. But point being is that it's a gaming environment, and I built the system in the idea that was a component that I needed to draw out a good story. Could I have drawn out a good story? Yeah, go ahead.
No. I'm sorry. As you're talking, I realized I'm sitting here nodding, laughing at myself. I'm sorry. Because I'm wrong what I just said. I have created actually a somewhat rich religious system in my Star Wars campaign, and I have notes and everything. It's not as deep as yours, not even close. I introduced it quietly when I GM for you and Brian way back. And yet you remember,
your short story that we're going to have to release soon now, I think covers it a little bit, doesn't it?
Well, not that one. I mean, maybe that was part of the impetus, but not that I was aware of. But I did introduce this, and then with my nephews, I have had it as a thread in the background. But to your point, I have never made it clearly manifest. Listeners, and Brad, you don't know all of this, but listeners, since we're probably not going to be playing anytime soon, and you don't talk to my nephews, so that's good. I developed this whole kind of backstory with internal imagery and everything for a highly religious priestly order of droids. And yeah, and that's right. And Brad's nodding. I introduced it to you guys, and then I let it go. And I've been running it. But again, it goes to your point of this can be difficult to instigate because it's not necessarily why people come to the table.
Yeah, and you hit it on the head. We didn't come to the table to play because of faith, religion, or spirituality. We came to the table to play, to do something analog, to do something together, to tell a story. I mean, any number of reasons you can come up with, but and I thought about this a lot. I'm like, I do a lot of academic self-study of faith. And I went through this in my head. I'm like, am I introducing this idea of faith and spirituality and this system I've developed into the game because I have to, because that's an underlying pin? I tried developing and changing the game. And I could have started somewhere else and had nothing in it. But I think the design I built isn't to push the idea of faith. Faith is a vehicle in this game to tell a story. It is not, the point of the game is not for anyone to worship deity or deities. The idea, I mean, I'm maybe giving a little bit away here for Jason, but hopefully not. The idea of faith and spirituality is a vehicle to drive a bigger narrative in the context of my game. But again, going back to my original question, for those that are listening to this, I would be curious to know if anyone has ever encountered resistance to, any sort of introduction of faith or spirituality into a gaming environment because maybe someone is of faith A and they don't want to play something different, or was it offensive? I'm not judging. I'm just curious if that's ever come up for folks.
Or equally important, what have been the challenges of having faith as a central component of your game or campaign, and players really making sure their PCs are acting through that lens, much like alignment, and how sometimes we, or me, regularly forget to factor that into the choices for my PC behavior. But if we're saying, well, no, my PC has a worldview, which they must, and if we're saying in this setting, part of that worldview is whatever belief system it is, then how does that affect PC and GM and storyline behavior?
Yeah, and in our world, or in the game that I've created and I'm DMing for, it is a very, what's the right way to put this? There isn't a lot of world travel. People don't really know anything outside of their own little town. Faith really wasn't in the discussion at the beginning of it. It was more of a political structure. Faith came in the middle as a vehicle, but you can play games without faith in them and be very successful. You can play games with a faith or spiritual system, either as a vehicle or as a central point, and be successful. What I would recommend, and I say this as a Christian with a capital C, nothing in front of it, just Christian, that I don't think there's anything wrong with playing in a world where you do or do not have that. That became and again, I don't want to go down, that became a whole point of the 1980s, D&D scare with Satanism and all that. Obviously, we're 30 or 40 years past that now. You don't hear about it much, or you don't hear about it at all, other than in the context of watching 80s retrospectives. But from a faith perspective, there's just, I look over it. I shouldn't turn because on my mic goes funny, but I'm periphery looking at my books from here, and I could look at any of the games. I have the Firefly RPG over there. How do you play? We could go down a whole path. I won't go down the path with Firefly, but I mean, just any game, Fate, depending upon the environment you build. Savage Worlds.
I mean, it's the name of the system is Fate.
Yeah. So, yours, I forgot about when you and Brian, you game mastered for Brian and I. And I don't remember all the detail, but I remember this idea of a priestly class and this introduction of sentience and self-awareness amongst androids. It reminded me a little bit at the end of, and I know you'll partially appreciate this and partially not, the movie iRobot, which is a pale comparison to the book. I know Jason's looking, he was going to jump on me. The only reason I bring the movie up is at the end of the movie, I cannot remember the name of the droid that
well, I don't remember the movie well enough, but the droid was Ardenil Oliva.
No, it's a different,
I don't think they used it.
No, they didn't.
Yeah.
The droid comes up, walks up the hill to where all the other droids are walking into the storage, and they stop when they see him and they turn around, and you get this feeling of sentience or of self-awareness. It obviously was trying to open up for another movie, but let's just say, for lack of a better term, they didn't stick to Asimov enough to make it worthwhile to make another.
Tells you how, because that was with Will Smith, right?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll watch anything with him. He's a really good actor. I really enjoy him, and I mean, I love, as you know, I love Asimov, and the iRobot, just the robot writings are some of, I think, his best. I don't remember the movie well at all because it paled in comparison, and what they did was very different. But no, I think that's right. I think with with my little droid religion thing. Yeah, we didn't really go anywhere with that. But remember in Star Wars, because you kind of bring up an interesting idea or point here, a connection. In Star Wars, there's this, I'm going to call it pseudo canon. It seems to be canon, but it's hard to tell, or at least I'm not sure it's really been officially canonized, though it's Star Wars and they'll canonize darn near anything if it's in print. But still, the notion is traditionally a droid, a higher level droid, right? A higher class droid in terms of I don't remember what the ordinals are, or the order of it, the 1, 2, 3, 4, in terms of the droid processors. The higher functioning droids, if you don't regularly do a memory wipe or a system purge, then over time they tend to become sentient. Look at C3PO, look at R2D2, look at whoever it was whom I'm forgetting, who walked with a swagger and was Lando's friend. Look at Chopper, etc., 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 etc.
The one in Rogue One that was voiced by Alan Tudyk. I cannot remember.
My KS09? No.
Yeah,
that's
you know
terrible.
what I'm talking. Reprogrammed.
We're gonna have to re-record this whole thing because we sound like idiots.
Yeah.
That is. Oh, he's what a good actor. That is one of my favorite droids. Who is maybe just achieving sentience, but yeah, you keep bringing up sentience and self-awareness among droids. Well, right, and so when a droid, when a whatever starts to become sentient, does it start to believe, right? Kind of like Philip K. Dick asking, do androids dream of electric sheep? And so anyways, to kind of keep the conversation going and to move past your Christian baggage of still wanting to play D&D, let's just call it is. It's so here, let's change tack a little bit. Well, obviously we're doing religion in your game that you're GMing, in your campaign, but when I look at the D&D source books and whatnot, you and I have been talking about these for a while. I really get a kick out of Candlekeep Mysteries, for example, but we've also been interested in a bunch of these. And as I've been thinking at it, as I've been prepping for this episode, I find I'm not overly attracted to the polytheism of a lot of D&D campaigns or of Pathfinder campaigns. I'd be glad to play in one. I have no problem with that, but it's kind of like sci fantasy doesn't resonate with me. A pantheon doesn't resonate with me, although it can make for fascinating stories. Like I look at the fantasy novels and shows and what that my two daughters are into. This is all the rage. And I mean, man, like you said to me how long ago, Marvel and the MCU is the Star Wars of their generation, of our kids. Well,
just remember now, the only time they brought it up in the context of Marvel was during Infinity War when they were on Titan. Was it Titan? No, it was on Titan, and Doctor Strange and Iron Man and Spider-Man are fighting, in effect, the Guardians of the Galaxy. They stop. Doctor Strange says, wait a second, who do you serve? And then Star-Lord says, what am I supposed to say? Jesus? And that's the only time
I disagree.
Really?
How many big time? How many characters are by definition demigods? How many characters are gods? I don't want to ruin anything for our listeners if they've not yet watched Loki, so I'm not going to say much, but the final episode of season 1, because it sounds like there's going to be a season 2. I have no idea how that's going to work out, but I've given up trying to predict anything with Marvel because clearly it's, well, we'll plan 45 things and then we'll just retcon the other 45. The final, Brad, you've seen this, right? The final, we're just nodding knowingly to one another. We're not going to say anything. The final episode is the most theistic discussion of the whole MCU, in my opinion. And I'm just gonna, you see where I'm going with that? I'm not gonna say anything because I know that by the time this ep comes out, we'll have a lot of listeners who have not yet seen it. But no, Marvel is full of deities, half deities. If you look at Guardians of the Galaxy,
Well, it's
lots
funny
of
because
fractional deities.
remember now, Chris Pratt's character, Quill,
Yeah,
is obviously during the second Guardians of the Galaxy, he meets his father,
there was God seed spread all over the universe.
Kurt Russell. But he
Yeah.
says as they get to his planet, Ego, he
Yeah,
says, I don't know if it was Drax or someone says, so you're a god or something like that. And he goes, yeah, small g. He said
right.
small g. So it's funny how in the Marvel universe, they do talk about gods, but air quote, small g. Like,
Well,
I
of
mean, let's be honest. You
course,
said Loki, Thor, those were the Norse gods. That was
right,
Norse
right.
polytheism.
I mean, they go around talking about Thor, god of thunder, Loki, god of mischief, and on and
Yep.
on and on. So but you're right, it's small g. But
I stand corrected
yeah,
on that.
let's
You're
be
right.
realistic though. As soon as you put a big G, you seriously limit your viewership and
Yep.
antagonize everyone else.
Mhm.
You know,
Well,
yeah.
I think that's another reason why Star Trek went the path they did, and they could tell a story. And I think you can tell, my original intent when I started writing our story was not to necessarily have it. I didn't go into it saying, okay, I'm going to write faith into it. Um, I would prefer, you said this before, you just said this, I would prefer playing games where faith wasn't involved, and not because of any personal position, but because I shouldn't say I shouldn't prefer, I don't care. There's such a richness of information out there, whatever game it is. You can play without tackling that type of subject and in effect creating issues with people.
Or flip side, you can have PCs or NPCs who have whatever belief system and majorly adds depth to the character, but without imbuing any set of assumptions into the game setting. Right. I mean, that's the beauty of all of these games. You can even in you can have a super cerebral, agnostic, if not overtly secular, atheistic Star Trek campaign, and there's absolutely no reason you can't have an entire planet full of people who worship the sandwich pickle of Ra. Right. It doesn't matter.
You
It
could have a
just adds
Bajoran
depth.
commander
Yep.
who might have a belief, but that doesn't play into it,
Right.
So I think it's interesting, and it's funny how you're hearing Jason and I go back and forth on this, and this is how our discussion started 30 years ago. And they weren't antagonistic. They were, we'd say something, we'd have an aha moment. We did it because we were trying to further our own understandings of truth. And I think you can do that in the RPG world. I think there's validity in going either way in the RPG world. I guess the point is that, that we're going to have to come back to this topic because we could go on for this forever, because you could look at how you develop an environment and how you handle. Let's just go past faith. Let's just talk about spirituality. Let's talk, instead of religion, let's talk spirituality, like Star Wars. You could have a spiritual culture or a spiritual people, and you use that, I think is what you're saying, use that as a vehicle to drive that character's decisions, but it isn't a center point. It isn't even on the periphery of the story itself.
Just adds depth to make the PC more interesting, the playing more challenging and enriching, the experience at the table all that much more fun.
Do you ever find yourself, so you mentioned before, independent of our game, so we were talking, like you said, you were, the pantheon of faith and all that. Do you think, be in a position where if you were to go to play a game and it had a more faith or religious based content, could you ever see yourself in a position where you'd be resistant to it? I'm not intending to put you on the spot. I have my own answer. I'm just curious.
Yeah, you are. That's a really interesting question. Probably not. I think it'll be really, really fascinating. I mean, again, like you said, we've been talking, and when you said at the start of the app 30 years. I was like, wait a minute, I don't. Oh yeah,
Yeah.
that's almost all that's like within a year or two. Yeah, it's been a
Yeah.
while, and so you and I have had these kind of debates for so long. Boy, Brad, good question. Could I, or not could I, is there anything that would make me uncomfortable? I don't think so, given the right setting. What I mean by that is, so if it were something fictional, then I'd have no problem with it at all. It would be really interesting. Like lately, I've heard bits and pieces of a few real playthrough episodes of Warhammer 40K. I think Wrath and Glory. I don't know. It's super super dark, and I don't care for the D10 mechanic at all. But it's just a fascinating. It's a fascinating storyline. It's I've never played it. I've looked at the manual as a PDF. I think of it in my mind, I get this image of Dune, but if Dune really went south and was on crack, I don't know how else to put it. It's really hardcore dark, but it's this fascinating thing, and they're like these deep, highly aberrant, hyper violent belief systems, and they sound really really interesting as just, again, a theater of the mind. Great. I mean, if you're gonna bathe in someone's blood, not really my forte, but if that's the character, yeah, I'll try a session. That's fine. I think if someone were GMing and they were GMing in one of the actual religions, on Earth, and they were taking it really seriously and really, like, importantly and personally, not only would that not interest me as being self-serving and honestly just intellectually banal, but it would make me a little uncomfortable of either risking cultural appropriation on my part or stepping over the line of offense because you stuck me in this world, but I'm going to treat it as a world of fiction. Well,
Yeah,
I mean, it is, but yeah.
that's not gaming, that's evangelism. If you're sitting down at a table to game with people and your intent is evangelism, whatever faith it is, then I think you're doing your table a disservice. I think if you want to use faith as a vehicle, I think the smarter thing to do is to build, either use one that exists within the context of the tomes that we have in the gaming world, or something that is unique that will help drive a narrative. The one that I keep going back to, the one I designed only because it's fresh in my mind. It doesn't, again, I'm trying to be very careful because I don't want to give anything away to Jason. It doesn't match anything that we have in the real world. And so I know that it's a comfort for us to play it because it isn't anything that really matches a faith out there. I am the same exact way as you. If someone's going in there to game and they're doing it in the context, or if it's not even a subtle underlying, if it's just blatant gaming in the context of a current faith, then my thought is, how fun is that going to be? Because a lot of that is there's no mystery. One, two, again, I'll say it differently. It's going to be offensive to someone. Even if it's not offensive to someone at that table at that moment, I think you're doing a disservice. And this is where we might disagree. And folks, this is where Jason and I, this topic, he and I could disagree to all day long, but we still love talking about this. I just think that doing that is a disrespect to the faith that is being used in the game, and to the other faiths that are out there. So if you want to use the Zoroastrian faith, sorry to the folks of you that are out there that are Zoroastrian, and you want to use that as a faith mechanism, that could be offensive. And I think you're doing a disrespect to that faith, as well as to Christians and Islam and Judaism, etc.
Okay, so I was going to go in a different direction, but what you just said in terms of Zoroastrianism, it brings to mind something I was thinking about at the very beginning of the episode, but then we went in a different direction. One of the concerns I have in terms of the actual games, and the canon around some of them. This is much more on the fantasy side, almost strictly the D&Ds, the Pathfinders, etc. And I use concern here in air quotes, listeners. I concern in the sense of it it nags at the back of my mind a little bit. So I think Paizo and Wizards, but especially Wizards, have gone out of their way, the publishers, not the magical people, have gone out of their way to make it known everyone is welcome to the table, and that they really are trying to broaden their worldview. Because like Brad, you've been talking about for a few eps that well, for example, as we're recording, the day we're recording this, our episode talking about D&D 1E dropped. Right. So to give listeners a sense of how far ahead we do this, but you look back at that. Well, one of the pushbacks that seems to have come against Wizards as they were looking at 5e and then some of the other stuff, and I don't remember where it came out in Tasha's or whatever, but one of the pushbacks, and it always bothered me a little bit, was the issue of orcs. Basically, you had this entire species or race of idiots. Well, that's not very enlightened. And so I'm drifting a bit, but in terms of the religion to come back, or the belief systems, so going back to Zoroastrianism and the others, D&D, and to a large but lesser extent Pathfinder, and I don't know about Starfinder, I guess, they have taken from an increasingly broad, diverse range of historical belief systems, historical mindsets, right? You can dip into ancient Greece, ancient Rome, ancient Egypt, et cetera, and something that I just question internally is, all right, when a name like Ahura Mazda comes up in D&D, and it wouldn't, because there are still believers, but yet they're riffing on something awfully close to a real belief system. At what point are we being respectful and broadening our own bucolic horizons? And at what point are we dipping into just cultural appropriation and around belief, around worldview? I don't have an answer for that, but it is something that nags at me with some of the really broad intercultural pantheons in these games.
Well, interesting point. What's the benefit of doing that? What's truly the benefit of dancing around? I'll use more simplistic terminology, dancing around a real faith within the context of a gaming system like this. I think, you can, like I said before, I can look over on my books and I can see books where they talk about different faiths. You can see it you could start to see it even in the 5e stuff for those that are new to the gaming system based off of the tome, Sword Coast and things like that. You could potentially see where there could be different deities based off of these different realms. But why? What would be the point of appropriating, and I get it. Like you said, we have ancient Egypt, we have ancient Greece, we have ancient Norse mythology and all that, that aren't really religions anymore. But still, for me, the creativity of starting from scratch or using something that's already pre-made without any sort of appropriation of an existing or historical faith, I would think is more fun, because you're introducing something that is a mystery. If you are introducing something that exists, but you're doing it in the realm of like what are the adventure path or whatever the case is, that I can see. But I think there's a line there. I really think there's a line there, and I hope they stick to it.
Now, I hear you, and I mean, I agree with you in general that homebrew is more fun than canned, and I don't mean to use that term disparagingly at all. We all take from canned to inform our homebrew. That's how games are made. That's how computers used to be built. That said, I think, to answer your rhetorical question, at least ideally by bringing all those things into the game canon, into the world of, of the Sword Coast or whatever, that we can take the game and broaden it beyond a perspective of, let's face it, the old cliche of a bunch of pasty white guys and gals, to now people who represent the beautiful diversity of our species across race, gender, belief, all of those interesting things. The challenge, though, being who's doing the writing, right? And so it's like, well, if you're talking about X, Y, or Z, but it's because you've read it in the book, that's a little harder. I think that's challenging, but I say keep going forward. That's how we advance. As an alternative, I do think there are at least a couple that come to mind, examples where this has been done very cleverly and I think quite well. So I think of Frank Herbert's Dune, and I think of you so religiously based. And one example is one of the major religions in known space being Zen Sunnism. But then, like the B'nai Gesserit, that's Hebrew. And he was so deeply read that he took from all of the major and several of the less major religions. Or let's go back to your favorite, DS9. Sorry, guys, it starts and stops with Trek. I can't help myself. But let's look at the Bajoran religion, because like you, that has fascinated me since it came out. Look at the Bajoran religion, ignoring the background of the writers and the producers and directors. What do we have? We have this amalgamation of Catholicism in terms of, right, this priestly class integrated with this clearly Buddhist sentiment of meditation and peacefulness and non-aggression, and then brought to a head, and most viewers don't realize this, I assume, brought to a head by the emissary, which is blatantly based on the Jewish concept of a shliach or a shliach tzibur, which is the emissary to a congregation. But there's never enough specific piece that stands on its own from any one of our actual religious worldviews, where they can be called out to say, well, no, you're just bastardizing this. Well, no, in fact, they're trying to create something new, and they're creating this wonderful story, this belief system for our PCs, if you will, that we can dip into, that hopefully, as intended, I assume, honor what's already been created, and then takes it in a new fictional direction. I think that's pretty cool.
Up until this moment, I didn't, for as long as we've talked, we've really never talked about this idea of the emissary and that connection. Didn't know that. And see, even in the middle of a podcast, I'll learn something. And that gives, obviously now Jason and I have some material that we'll have to talk about just for the sake of talking. And as we record this, our core group of friends, we're going to connect and meet in a central location between all of us for the first time, potentially. I know you said a year and a half. I think it's 2 years since we've all been able to get together. Yeah. And it's as religiously and spiritually diverse a group as it comes. And let's be honest, folks, remember, again, this is where we could go down a rabbit hole, and I know we're going to get short on time, but I want to make 2 points. One, you can be spiritual and not have faith or have a religion. You can be religious and follow religious custom, but not be spiritual or have a faith in a higher being. So when it comes to gaming, and leading a game or being a PC, it's not black and white. You're going to have to determine how you want to play that out. Do you have, a religion that's like a magisterium type of religion, and how do you play that out? And can characters be spiritual without, like Star Wars, you can be spiritual without there being a air quote organized religion? One. Two, You keep bringing up Dune, and I'm jumping too far ahead here into the GM corner, but I can't do it now. But Modifius has the new Dune RPG out there, so
I've been watching that too.
yeah, I am purposefully not going to Amazon or to Modifius's website, because that game fascinates me, almost not even so much to play, but to read, just to read how they've put together all of the Dune material into a source book.
It's funny you say that, Brad, because I've been debating whether to reread just the first Dune novel, with the movie coming out in not too long, with the RPG. It's out there for pre-order right now, I think. Is that right?
Yes.
I've been, and then I was in the bookstore not too long ago, quite recently, with my girls, and Dune is out everywhere in this beautiful reprint again. And yeah, we'll have to talk more about that on offline, because I am curious. I'm tempted.
And I would recommend folks, if you can find it, it's very hard to find. Sci-Fi Network, I think, did a Dune and a Children of Dune miniseries. I want to say close to 20 years ago.
I didn't know
and
that.
Yeah, and Paul Atreides had children, right?
Right.
And his son,
yep,
is played by a very young James McAvoy, aka the young Professor Xavier from the later X-Men films. And you can tell he's very young, and Susan Sarandon's in it, and there's a couple other A and B level actors. But I know that the original Dune movie that came out in '84 or whatever caused a lot of consternation amongst folks. If you watch the miniseries, it is a little hokey. It does have some 20-year-old CGI involved in it, but it did and it's a mini series. There's two of them. It does do a better job, and it is a good watch. But you're going to have to find it on YouTube. It's very hard to find anywhere.
I remember watching the movie with Sting when we were kids, pretty young. And I have these memories of it, like watching, like, what the heck is going on? And if you go back and watch the trailer now, seriously, listeners, it is, we did this not too long ago. It is worth its weight in gold. Not only do you see a very young Patrick Stewart, well before his Star Trek days, but you just listen to the voiceover of how high tech this was considered. And then you watch it, and it's like, this is terrible in retrospect. But okay, well, we're clearly in the GM corner already.
Yep, sorry. So I jumped us right in. So Brad, what's the latest for you in terms of reading and working on? And I know I just to pass it along again, I think Jason gets a little feels a little self-serving. Go back, folks, read the article on trek.com. Listen to our interview with the authors, one of them being the person I'm talking to here. I think it will get your juices flowing for Trek. And I found it fascinating. It got me. Oh, I'm going to stop there because that'll go into the GM corner. You go ahead. Just hold that thought.
Okay. What am I doing? I think in the last episode in the GM corner, I mentioned that I was waiting for my copy of Secrets of the Force, which is the what is it? Altman and Gross oral history of Star Wars. I've mentioned this before. Their 2-volume history of Star Trek was just brilliant. I just started reading that today. I'm literally just a few pages in, and I sent you a picture of this right an hour or two before our ep. I'm holding on to this because the Secrets of the Force, it's a thick one. That'll take a while to read. But I discovered, yay, Amazon, not to plug them, though I'm pretty sure I'm single-handedly keeping them in business. But okay, Brad too. Yeah, but I think I discovered this yesterday morning. I mean, literally like 24 hours before it arrived. I I have really come to enjoy Star Trek Lower Decks, which I've got to think by the time you hear this, we'll have already started season 2. Really looking forward to that. Well, I knew that Mike McMahon, the EP, the executive producer, he he had this idea initially by creating an unauthorized, joke intended, pun intended, 8th season of TNG. And he did that on Twitter and got a really big following. I mean, I don't twit. I never followed it. But I knew that kind of started this because he got quite the fan base. Well, I discovered the other day, Brad, and I sent you this picture of the book, of the cover, that Simon and Schuster, right, who holds the license, of course, to publish all the canon Star Trek materials, they printed back in 15. This is 6 years old. And I just had no idea. They printed essentially a book version of season 8 from Mike McMahon, and I was reading the excerpts and I was laughing out loud at like the dialogue, the fictional dialogue. Well, of course it's fictional. You know what I mean? The non-canonical fictional dialogue, like between Picard and Wesley, or Worf and Data. I was laughing out loud, and it's like, okay, I have to get this. So that's what I'm doing. What are you up to?
Yeah, so I said to hold thought after the article and our interview discussion, and then our leadership discussion, I dove back into some of the Modiphius Star Trek stuff. I'm reading I'm reading more of it like a book. I'm reading the core rule book, but I'm also on my desk to the right of the microphone, looking at Genesis, because we've been teasing this to the point where it's not even subtle anymore. Yep, Jason is showing. Yep, this idea of taking Genesis and using it for Star Trek, and obviously there is some pun intended when you use the term Genesis when it comes to
really
Star
trying
Trek.
to avoid that.
I know, so we have to find another way to. We have to find a different way to call it, but the Star Trek through Genesis RPG eyes type of thing. So it's interesting because as I've been reading through Genesis and talking or thinking about Star Trek, this idea of faith came up only because how do we introduce it, if at all, in the context of any story, if we have Bajorans? And if we have Bajorans, doesn't even matter if it even comes up. And you can go back and listen to the episode. We've kind of
well, and what about the Klingons?
Oh yeah, Kalis, and yeah. So I'm surprised that didn't even come up earlier. So there's such a plethora of material that I've got in this house, way more than I should, way more than I can keep up with. So knowing Jason keeps sending me pictures of books, and I keep giving him mean gestures over camera, because
and then he buys the books.
Yeah, because then that my wish list keeps growing instead of shrinking. So before we go and before I turn it over to Jason to wrap it up, I want to thank everyone for continuing to listen. We're starting to see growth in the base. We actually saw people from outside the country download episodes and listen to them. We are recording. We are pretty far ahead in our recording because I keep using this term, our creative juices are so flowing that even last week when we were recording an episode, Jason's like, okay, I'm ready. When do you want to do the next one in our series? And I'm like, okay, let's go tomorrow. We both are just really into this right now. We've talked about leadership. We've talked about faith. We're going to talk about economics. Then we're going to go talk about games. We're going to introduce some Star Trek stuff with Genesis, the RPG at some point. I've got to, now that my gaming friend is back, I have that bonus episode. We've got people we want to bring on the show. We want to have Jason's partner in writing back to continue the leadership. There's just so much going on right now. And we were just talking last night, we're approaching almost a couple hundred downloads, which for us 10, 11 episodes in coming at this from a different perspective. We aren't twitching out there and having you watch us game. It would be the most boring Twitch episode you've ever seen. And I've seen some really boring ones, but I hope that this is touching a nerve in a good way with people, because we're trying to introduce and talk about this material in a way that's a little different than other people do it. So I'll leave that with that as kind of an open-ended discussion topic. And Jason, you can speak your mind and then wrap it up.
Yeah, Brett, absolutely. And listeners, to reiterate and to really make the point of what Brad is trying to convey to all of you, we're in this for the long haul. We're having a great time. We hope you are enjoying listening half as much even as we enjoy doing this together. It really does get the creative juices flowing. We are at a point now where we would really love to hear from all of you, not merely your feedback, but your suggestions. Something we haven't been saying since the early episodes is, in addition to asking you to follow, subscribe, and rate us on Apple Podcasts, Google, Amazon, wherever you go, in addition to finding us as Dice in Mind on Facebook, please remember our email, theguys@diceinmind.com. That's theguys@diceinmind.com. We really would like to begin to meaningfully interact with our listener base. That's right, both of you. We want to hear from you. If you have topic ideas, we're all ears.
I think there's 3 now, bud.
It could be, but we'll probably lose one. If you have interview suggestions, we would like to hear that. Brad and I have a short list of people we would eventually like to reach out to have for brief interviews on the podcast, bigger name people. Let us know. Give us some feedback. Let us know how we can make this even more interesting to you. And with that, as always, we wish you well. We wish you happy times at the table. As the summer months begin to wrap up and fall is still, for many of us, a ways away. Stay well, stay healthy. We will see all of you in a couple of weeks.